Well, as we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Welcome to Sydney Ideas, University of Sydney's flagship public talks program. My name is Kate Harrison-Brennan. I'm the director of the Sydney Policy Lab, which is where community members and academics come together to solve complex policy challenges. We work with people from all walks of life to set the agenda, experiment, and make public policy that transforms lives. I'm your host for tonight's event, Is Storytelling Essential to Innovation? Presented with the Sydney Policy Lab and the Charles Perkins Centre, a fellow multidisciplinary initiative here at the university, committed to easing the burden of chronic disease. And we have some great people here with us this evening to explore the idea of creativity and collaboration. I'd like to introduce to you Sophie Gee, Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Sydney and a Professor in the English Department at Princeton University. Sophie is a novelist, journalist and scholar. She's also a producer and co-host of The Secret Life of Books, a podcast about classic books. Welcome, Sophie. Next, Steve Simpson is Academic Director of the Charles Perkins Centre. He's also a professor in the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at the university. Welcome, Steve. And Charlotte Wood is the author of 7 novels and 3 books of non-fiction. Her latest book, Stoneyard Devotional, was shortlisted for the 2024 Booker Prize. Welcome Sophie, Steve and Charlotte.
Thanks, Kate.
This evening's conversation came about as we wanted to champion the value of blue sky thinking. We've enjoyed sharing questions, thoughts and uncertainties on this topic between ourselves, and we really wanted to expand the conversation. How do big breakthroughs happen? Whether in business, policy, science or writing, it seems great stories of innovation share the same surprising ingredients: contingency, serendipity, curiosity, generosity, and friendship. So as a starting point, I wanted to share what I've learned from each of our speakers on creativity, storytelling, and innovation. So from Charlotte, here is an excerpt to the preface of her book, The Luminous Solution. Other people's creative lives have always fascinated me. My writing room at home contains several shelves of books on the nature of art and creativity, collections of interviews with writers and artists, how to write instruction manuals, discussions of the elements of fiction. These books happen to be shelved directly behind my chair. They have my back. Charlotte writes, I'm not sentimental about keeping books. I don't have room. And I prefer to see the books I read as passing through my life like a river of knowledge and feeling. Occasionally, I'll step into the river and pull one out to keep before it is swept past. But I eventually let the current take most of them. And yet I've never knowingly discarded one of the books on these shelves. I'm superstitious about them. I value their expertise and solidarity too much to let them go, despite not having looked at most of them now for a decade. The feelings remain that they are indispensable companions and guides to a life that is often confusing, sometimes lonely, and occasionally frightening. Steve, you tell some pretty captivating stories about creativity and innovation that I've enjoyed a great deal. As I understand it, the story of the Charles Perkins Centre begins in 1987 in some senses, when your colleague David Robenheimer and you met while taking a group of first-year Oxford zoology students on an ecology field trip to Whiteham Woods outside Oxford. In this ancient beech forest, which you can see on the screen, you and David decided that you wanted to reconceive the entire field of nutrition using locusts, the swarming grasshoppers of biblical fame, an unlikely hero. And Sophie, hearing you speak at the Sydney Writers' Festival earlier this year, not only did I get to appreciate your dry humour and to get a glimpse of what it would be like to be one of your lectures at Princeton, but also to be drawn into the tale of how novels ask to be read. You said, novels catch us between believing and not believing. With the best novels, they catch us in a state between believing and not believing our own lives, not just the novels. Novels can, in other words, be completely disorienting and disarming. And this has an interesting history. We've not always been able to read into other people's minds. We had to invent a technology that could do it, and that is the novel. So, as companions and guides to a life that is often confusing, sometimes lonely, occasionally frightening, let's enter into some wayfinding. In this evening's conversation, in which we're asking the question, is storytelling essential to innovation? I want to begin with a question of what do we mean by storytelling? And I might pass with that to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Yeah, it's funny. I'm a bit of a kind of a Grinch about storytelling in a way, because I think people think you're a novelist, you're a wonderful storyteller, and it's a kind of, I always feel uncomfortable with it because, yes, that's what happens as a result of creating a novel, but I never think of the process of creating a novel as a process of telling a story. First of all, I think of it as sort of, it's just much messier than that. Because we think of a story as something that is quite orderly. It has a shape, it has a beginning, a middle, and end. I mean, there's lots of ways of telling a story, but it seems to me that in terms of innovating, creating, it's a much more chaotic process, and that word storytelling would lead you to believe. And I've often talked about the process of writing fiction being sort of like being a sculptor with a lump of clay, except the difference is at first we have to invent the clay before we can shape it. So, and I guess that inventing the clay part is the really messy, chaotic, serendipitous, failing over and over and over again part. Then once the clay is there, then it would start to be able to become a story in the way that I work.
Now, I've not seen a lot of clay at the Charles Perkins Centre, but you do a great deal of creative making of things. What's your experience with storytelling, Steve?
I think, actually, Charlotte, you've just described the life of a scientist as well. A scientist, storytelling is after the fact, it's after the event, it's making the best of a bad job. The clay is coming up with the inspiration, the ideas, the testing of ideas, mostly that don't work, the elaboration of ideas, the following of avenues that weren't originally intended, and ultimately writing the story that makes best use of the data. The difference being, in our case, clay is the data, and once you've got the data are immutable, but the way in which you tell the story is entirely creative. And so one of the great mistakes I think that young scientists make is that when they come to write their first scientific paper, they feel that they have to write it in the order in which they did it. And whereas they have to be true to the data, that's entirely the wrong way of going about it, because the best story may start at the end. The reason you did it can be post hoc. So there's a bit of a confection there. There's a bit of an idea that science writing is formulaic, that you know what you're doing before you do it. You're testing hypotheses. It's highly, it's equivalent to having KPIs that you live out. It doesn't work like that. It's a shambles, and the best things come out of nowhere.
How
Do you
does
want me to tell you about the Charles Perkins Centre? That's the same for the way we built the Charles Perkins Centre. We can pick up on that. But
Let's go
I
back
love
to that.
actually. Yeah. I'm going to drop the clay metaphor. I have nothing to add. So I was thinking about this wonderful idea that you're both suggesting, which is basically that when you have a story, having a story is how you know that you finished a project, basically.
Yeah.
That it's taken shape. And my husband's a writer, a different kind of writer. He's a fantasy writer, and we often talk about why is it the case that when we're embarked on these giant creative projects that we do in different ways, whether it's writing an academic book, a book of criticism, whether it's a novel, whether it's a screenplay, or the project I'm doing at the moment, which is a podcast. Why do we seem to just plough massive amounts of time into things and throw them away? Was all that work wasted? All that stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor? And we have, we always say to one another, remember that the things that end up not being in there are actually part of the story. They're crucial parts of the story, in fact, that have to be left out in order actually to clarify the story, but they are still there. They're still part of it. And as someone who thinks a great deal about literature, the history of literature and the history of the novel in particular, something I always encourage students to connect with about stories is that what is not said is as important as what is said. The voice that appears not to be there is almost always the crucial voice rather than the speaker that dominates a narrative.
Can I jump in there? That idea that all the failure is progress is really hard to internalise.
Really hard.
Because you just think, it's not working.
Yeah.
I mean, after a long period of making work, you do understand that it is, that's, just the way it is.
Yes.
Doesn't mean this isn't going to work. But it's still almost impossible to believe that every time.
Well, it's a very unacceptable social narrative, isn't it?
Yeah.
To embrace failure, I think.
And it's something I think that, if it's really, as you've said, Steve, treading on the line of chaos, and Sophie, you don't potentially have a story until you have a completed project. There's all the messy middle that comes after starting a project before you could possibly say you have a story to tell, and that's quite difficult for organisations to deal with. This is something you've reflected on, Charlotte.
Yeah, I read, I can't remember where I read it, a study years ago that said, it showed that basically nobody wants creativity, actually. We think we do. We love the idea of it, but when it's looking us in the face, we reject it over and over again. And even in organisations where someone is employed specifically to be creative, the organisation will do everything in its power to stop that happening. And it's because we don't like a failure. And organisationally, I don't know, Steve has created this incredible thing with the Charles Perkins Centre, and we have talked about risk, and I was working there at one point, risk and failure being part of, it's in the fibre of the organisation, which is unheard of. And even in the book world, when our lovely, beloved marketing people go to market our books, the way they do that is by saying, it's like this thing. They can't say this is a new book there isn't anything like it, because they think nobody will want it, and they're right. Yeah. So when we say we want creativity, what we really want is something that replicates already existing creativity.
It's not an add-on. You've got to design it in from the beginning, and that's precisely what we did in the Charles Perkins Centre. We took inspiration from the most creative devices or processes in the known universe, and their complex adaptive systems.
So tell us more about this, because it seems to be at the
heart of so much powerful creativity, whether that be the evolution of life on Earth, whether it be the development of the brain. They're all founded on trying too many things, exploring the realms of possibility and throwing away 90% of it because it didn't work. And it's those voids left by the things that are no longer there that provided the substance to create the solutions and the complexity that is life on Earth, or is the functioning conscious brain, or the developing embryo. They're all founded on failure and trying things out with a selective pressure that prospers on attracting attention and success. And that's the process, that's the fundamental process. I remember when you were writing The Weekend in the Charles Perkins Centre, Charlotte, and you said to me one day, it's dead, it's not alive.
I think I said that for at least 2 years.
Yeah, and
Because it
then
was.
suddenly it came to life.
Yeah.
And that that's an extraordinary thing. That's the spark.
So fascinating. And how do you know that moment where it comes to life?
Well, for me, and I think for a lot of artists, it's a bodily reaction almost. It's a physical response. And more as I go on as a writer, I trust the body more than the mind in some ways, because a lot of the things that actually end up making a work live, are not, they don't make any sense at the time. But something in your instinct knows that there's something here, and now I've got an engine ticking over. But it takes a lot of, I think, some experience and guts, I think, to just keep on working for. I mean, the weekend was definitely 2 years of it not working. Other books have been 3 years of not working. But thinking there's something here, I don't know what it is, but I have this instinct that I want to keep doing it. Other things fall away, but there's, I don't know, you just follow your nose. But I know scientists have that, you have a hunch, right?
Same thing, yeah. And I think that's the essence of genius and talent. If you can tell those things and persist, you can't do that with an AI large language model. That's something that's intangible and is at the essence of things that are alive, and that's the best writing and the best science.
I think that you use the phrase "the genius of it," and you used a very biological metaphor to describe that kind of experience, Charlotte, in coming back to a piece of writing. There was a piece you wrote earlier this year on inwardness and outwardness, and you use a metaphor of coming back to something you had left and kind of sensing through a membrane, I think, that it kind of had a pulse.
Oh, yes.
And you came back to it. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yes, when I remember what I wrote. It was about, that piece was in a newsletter I was writing about, and it was about the kind of danger of ceding too much privacy, in my sense of creative privacy. And in the current world of marketing art, I suppose, the way that you tend to do that is by talking about the story behind the story. And lots of writers kind of really struggle with, well, I want the book to be the story, not my life. But anyway, but as a reader and a viewer of art and everything, I love hearing the story behind the story. So we're all kind of in it. But I just started to have a sense that, and because I've been doing a lot of public stuff this year, and I was starting to fray a little bit, and it was funny that I wrote that piece and then a week later heard about the nomination for the Booker Prize. It was like, oh, more. But it was a strong sense that there needs to be a very strong membrane between the private creative self and the public self. And I don't know where that membrane idea came from, but it's sort of porous, but it needs to be protected. The inner life needs to be protected. And what do you think about that, Sophie?
Yes, it's really fascinating as you were talking, because, well, my mind is going in many directions right now, and there's one that I'd like to come back to pre-membrane, which is continual failure. Because I had this wonderful experience last week where I reread the Odyssey, not having read it in its entirety for many, many years.
You've heard it here first.
Decades. What?
An admission that you haven't read the Odyssey in a good long while.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And, I was reading it and I was like, oh, this is really good. Wow, this is a nice one. And sort of also realising that all of literature in some sense is grappling with this thing of trying to retell that story. And it made me think about how, and it's not even just all of Western literature, like many literatures are grappling with these attempts to retell stories that were perhaps only partially told the first time around, or where the story itself was story of continual failure, which was, I guess, the thing that struck me about the Odyssey. He's always screwing up, basically, and it's sort of not panning out. And just this kind of, it kind of made me think about how artists and writers and thinkers and creators have always been grappling with this conundrum of failure being necessary for story and how to make sense of it. And the fact that it's not just a one-off, like I'm assuming that every time you write a novel, it happens again. I mean, it definitely happens every time I have an idea.
Philip Roth said in an interview that he said, when I start a book and it's going well, I know that's a problem. You know, he says if it's fluency is a sign that something's not right.
Yeah.
And he said what I'm doing at the start is I called my thesis on this, looking for trouble. I'm looking for trouble. I'm looking for something that's going to resist me. And I don't know why that needs to be so, but I think maybe it's to find something new. I think you're right that all stories, you know, end up following certain deeply ingrained myths, I suppose. But it's almost important that you don't know that as you're doing it. Like the book has to have its own life without you knowing too much about it. I mean, it's the way I work. It's not the way everybody works. I know.
How does that map onto scientific thinking?
It ultimately maps onto complex systems theory, actually. So the mathematics of all of these processes, you probably heard in popular parlance around this, the notion of riding the edge of chaos. And complex non-linear systems, and any set of ideas or biological process is one of those, you can either be in crystalline states or chaotic random states. Neither is particularly interesting. Or you can ride, and you can visualize this in these mathematical models, you can ride this creative crest, which is called the edge of chaos. And if you can walk along the edge of chaos, you end up with the surprising, you end up with the unexpected, you end up with the original, the innovative, and you're able to adapt to circumstances much more adroitly than if you're crystalline or a dog's breakfast. So failure and trying lots of things is not the solution to success any more than having rigid KPIs is. You need to ride the edge of chaos.
Isn't that interesting of what leaves open possibilities? And it makes me think actually, Sophie, about the way that you've spoken of the conventions in literature of what would spell the death knell of a story was, and reader, she married, or something of the equivalent. But there are accepted ways in which we make sense of a dead end, but also in the ways in which we try to leave possibilities open for there to be contingency, for there to be serendipitous connections. And it seems that these are all themes that we experience and about which I've really enjoyed learning a great deal. One of the other notes from your speech at Sydney Writers' Festival, Sophie, was around the importance of the novel of actually bringing us into the interiors of people's lives. And it's something that we've touched on in conversation with one another, is just the importance of the inner life. You know, we referenced that just before about the importance of inwardness and outwardness and the distinctions to be navigated there. But I wonder, how do you see the importance of the inner life, or even interiority when it comes to animals, to the pursuit of creativity?
Yeah. I've tried to hit on you about this before, and you sort of weren't taking it, so I'm going to try again.
Try again.
More people. You have to be polite. So I think, as someone who thinks about the history of novels as opposed to the writing of them, although I have written a novel, that inwardness, that is to say, being able to get into someone else's head and really have a sense of what their experience is, specifically how it's different from yours. You know, this is the elusive problem of being a human, right? You kind of need to model other people's inwardness, partly as a survival mechanism, but also as a sort of act of love, as an act of fidelity, sometimes actually as an act of competition. You know, you have to be effective at modelling another person's inwardness. And the novel was this amazing, which started in the 18th century. We haven't always had novels. It's the most recently invented major literary technology, in fact. Novels had this incredible innovation, which was that they were able to go inside people's heads in this very effective way, using various techniques. And, the thing that's so fascinating about it, I think, as a literary historian, is that they simulate the interior of a person's mind with extraordinary persuasiveness. They're very sort of real feel, oftentimes, a novel. And yet it is a simulation, it's a fake. What I tried to make you say is that in a similar way, you are going after, these questions of sort of insect metabolism and, trying to get inside, maybe trying to get inside the minds of metabolic states, but you're definitely thinking about why that is valuable.
Yeah, why didn't I agree
I don't
with
know.
that, Sophie?
I was very off
Goodness.
put at the time, Steve, but
So,
it's your redemption moment.
I've kind of been listening.
Yeah.
That's
The
fun.
plot twist.
No, but if you're an animal biologist who's studying the natural world, seeking inspiration for a deep understanding of the human condition, whether that's using locusts, as Kate introduced, ultimately to try and understand global obesity, itself an unexpected journey. But what you're trying to do is say, why are you doing what you're doing of your study animal? You want to, I suppose, be empathetic in a way. You want to get inside its head. Literally, you want to get inside its head with electrodes and measure what's going on in there to try and understand how it works so that you can see whether there's any inspiration in that mechanism that might enlighten us about ourselves. And the answer to that is yes, in that case. But there's a whole body of early work in behaviorism and in the study of animals. The worst thing when I was growing up as a young academic behavioral scientist, the worst thing you could do is anthropomorphize. So I didn't want to give anything away that would indicate that I thought my locust was a little person. So that was a cardinal sin. Now there's been a big change in the way we understand animal minds. Peter Godfrey Smith here, for example, has written beautifully about cephalopod, octopus brains and so on. So there is this line between trying to infer what something's doing by using your own intuition and empathy and not overstepping the boundary.
So interesting. That was a much better answer.
Thank you.
And I think, there's been an argument that you've made now, Charlotte, of this interior life or the privacy required is essential to art flourishing. Do you have any further reflections on this at this part of the year after such a busy season?
Well, I was thinking today about, I knew we were going to be talking about the inner life and why it's important, and I sort of struggle really to articulate it, but I thought one reason it's important is that that we need to have a part of ourselves that can't be put to use or monetized or, that is there just like art for its own sake, for no purpose. Because I think more and more in our culture that if something has no visible purpose, then, it's really in danger, and especially if it can't be, make money for somebody. So the idea that there is a part of all of us that can be held away from the forces of kind of utilitarianism, I suppose.
So interesting.
It's really kind of precious to me.
And that sense of what is intimate not being able to be valued in the modern economy, it makes me think, as I've heard each of you speak about the ways in which policy, or for us having a policy lab, policy in some senses, when it's what government chooses to do or not to do, is storytelling writ large, but it's based on various forms of data and knowledges that are drawn from people or are otherwise kind of erase knowledge or stories from people. And in our work seeking to champion the relational economy, we're seeking to connect with people's own stories about why they value care, and in that sense give them a space to tell quite intimate stories about why they give and receive care, why they value that, and forms of transactions that are not normally valued in our economy that aren't wrapped up into concepts of workforce or other things, and to seek to champion that idea of a relational economy that actually is broad enough to hold people's stories about what they value there with care. Moving to the next part of our conversation, central to the way each of you have experienced creativity and sought to explain it is really this concept of the collision of the unlikely. And we've talked about that in various different ways, but I want to ask you, why is that so? Why is it that the collision of the unlikely is important, and how do you see that operating in your work or art?
I'm not going first on this one.
I'll pass to you, Steve.
It's just fundamental. So that I guess the best way I can answer that is to give you some examples of my own collisions or things that happened that changed the direction of things in ways that turned out to be important. And it started, as you said, in Whiteham Woods in 1987 with a couple of ambitious young zoologists who decided that the rest of the world had got it wrong around nutrition and we were going to redefine the whole thing. Why not do it on locusts? And that was a kind of weird idea in the sense that if I went to a funding agency at that point and said, look, we want to spend the next 35 years working on insects because we'll understand obesity better, I wouldn't have got very far and I wouldn't have met my KPIs and I would have been considered a waste of money. But it ended up that way, and it ended up that way because of random events as we went through that journey. There was a global decision taken to ban a poison that was used to control locust swarms in North Africa. And that changed the landscape of locust control, and suddenly I had funding to work on what I was doing because I could make the case that trying to understand locusts was now going to be really important because we'd lost the main chemical for controlling them. Now that was a decision taken by global governments that led to me getting money to be allowed to do the things that I wanted to do that ultimately ended up in Berlin for a year in an extraordinary place where we came together with researchers from across disciplines, saw that you could do things differently, and ultimately that led to the Charles Perkins Centre and many other things, made possible by a woman who turned up randomly on an overnight flight from Texas and gave us a Picasso painting.
Yeah.
Now, you don't script those things. That
In a plastic bag, as I understand
in
it.
a plastic bag. And you just grab those opportunities and you run with them and go in the direction that you want to go at that time.
Sophie.
Okay, I'm ready now. So the collision of the unlikely. I mean, this is what when you find that, that's where the magic is. I mean, it's the it's not surfing the chaos thing, but riding the chaos. I was thinking actually about, my go-to example is always Pride and Prejudice. Anyone who's heard me speak before will know that I always go to Pride and Prejudice. And I'm thinking about the kind of audacity of Jane Austen's joke in that novel, which then became the greatest love story of all time, was having two people with completely colliding personalities meet one another, and what happens with that? How do you play with that? And that is the kind of force of that novel. And we have normalised it because it's a story that's now been told and told again. But when you actually reread Austen, or in fact any great piece of literature, what you're often struck by are these highly unlikely personalities coming into collision or contact with one another, and there's the story that has to be kind of worked through. And I would even go so far, and the other thing, and then I'll stop talking, is that I say to students when they're trying to read texts as opposed to write them, they're trying to find stories in text, is the moment where something seems to be strange or going off the rails, or where you're looking for, where you find trouble, that's where the story is. But especially when you're reading old books, you're sort of like, oh, he's using a cow's head to sort of make love to his wife. Oh, that must have been what they did in the medieval period. But no, it's not. If something seems to be strange, it is strange, and that's where the magic is happening. And so I think that sort of unlikelihood is the sort of prize of reading. Yeah.
I want to be in your class, Sophie.
It's not that fun.
Love
Actually,
to hear you
but
talk like that.
That was good.
Well, I think that's where the art is also,
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah.
And in the making of art, when you find those, and when something comes alive, when I've been trying to massage this dead thing into life, often it's some new, unlike element comes in somehow, and you just shove it together. And the joining of unlike things is one of the hallmarks of sort of creativity studies. That's the kind of major element of creativity, is putting unlike things together. And I think it's often it's exciting because it's where energy comes from.
And as I understand it, one of those unlikely things came about because of your time in residence at the Charles Perkins Centre.
Oh yeah, so when I was writing The Weekend, so I had a residency at the Charles Perkins Centre because Steve, being a genius, has decided that a science research facility needs a creative writer in residence just to be there. And this is the great kind of incredible joy of this program, is you just work there, you do your work, you bump into people randomly, you have conversations. You don't have to show work, you don't have to teach, you don't have to show that you are writing the thing you said you were going to write. I mean, it's got far more creativity than any arts program I've ever seen anywhere. So I was the first person in this position, which was amazing, but it was also kind of scary because I was like, well, how does this work? And nobody knew, it was a kind of an experiment. But the one thing I did know is that I was there to be influenced by the place and to influence it in whatever way sort of happened. And I had a conversation with David Robenheimer, Steve's long-time colleague, an amazing researcher. And I was asking him about something about, I knew my book was about older women and friendship. And I was asking him something about taste buds and nutrition as you get older, because I wanted to have this woman who was in a restaurant or something. Anyway, and he answered my questions, but he seemed to be fairly bored with the whole conversation. And that was fine. And then he said, well, look, I'd just like to see some evolutionary biology in your book. And I thought, well, would you? I mean, my normal process would have been just like, well, I wouldn't have been talking about my book anyway to someone I didn't know, and I wouldn't talk about it as I was making it, but that was my job, to be there. So, and ordinarily I would just, someone says, I think you should put this in your book, I just think, see ya. But because my job there was to be open to things that made me uncomfortable, I just sort of didn't shut that down as I normally would, and I said, well, okay, but I can't really see how, I don't know what you mean. And he said, well, I just think animal aging, for example, is far more accelerated than human aging. So maybe you should have animal. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's interesting. But I couldn't see how I could use it, really. And then, at the same time, my friend Prue is actually here, her beautiful old dog, Finn. Sorry, Prue. Her old, beloved dog was falling apart and nearing the end of her life. In my book, it's a boy dog. But I could see suddenly, oh, here's an animal aging, and all the great emotional heft of watching that aging of an animal that we sort of don't want to watch in humans. We put it away, we don't look at it, we just try and avoid it. So, long answer, sorry. And so then I could see how this animal coming into my book had all sorts of uses to me, narratively, emotionally, thematically. And it was because of this conversation that I would never have had in any other way. But it was completely serendipitous when I wanted to talk about this thing. But he happened to talk about that thing.
And you said, I remember at the time, that that's when the novel came to life
Yeah.
as well. And on top of that, Brain and Mind Centre had the world expert on
I went to this
dementia in
lunch.
dogs.
I said, that's all right, the novel's going to be okay because I've got a demented dog in it. And Steve and his colleague said, oh, have you talked to our demented dog researcher? I'm like, what?
Naturally.
And there was, and I did have this incredible conversation about it.
Well, before we turn to questions from the audience, and I'll give you a bit of an overview of just how to use Slido in a moment, I did want to throw kind of a lightning round to each of the three of you. You've spoken, Charlotte, about the way in which a new idea came to being because of the place you're in, the conversations you're allowed to happen that you may not normally. And I wanted to ask you, as you think about kind of creativity ahead, is there a particular place you want to put yourself into, or things that you're curious about exploring that might lead to new knowledge or a new discovery for you? So a place or something you're curious about that you want to interact with.
This is going to sound like I'm sucking up to the panellists and the audience, but for the first time in my professional life since I've been at Sydney University, I haven't been in an academic department. I've been working with the leadership of the university and therefore getting to meet people across many departments and disciplines. And the exhilaration and the happenstance too of having kind of demented dog conversations, just like all the time. There's always someone working on a demented dog or its equivalent. It's incredibly exciting. And just sort of, you know, that you were being sort of polite, but that conversation where you're like, this is going to bore me. And then really trying to see what happens, you know, because so often if you open up to it, there's something there that just completely transforms your thinking. So I'm going to say Sydney University.
And what about you, Steve?
Look, I can even elaborate on that. Actually, I think big comprehensive universities like the University of Sydney, but of course there are many others, are a potential. They're a wellspring for extraordinary creativity, but they're not structured appropriately.
Yes.
They're siloed within disciplines, and you end up talking to people who you already know. And if you're too close to somebody else, you're a competitor and have to be killed. If you're too different from somebody else, by definition, what they do is boring. But if you look at the richness and the depth and diversity of knowledge across a big comprehensive university, there's no other institution in society that aggregates like that. But we're totally hopeless at liberating and joining and connecting, and that's what places like the Policy Lab, the Charles Perkins Centre, the multidisciplinary initiatives have untapped. And seeing, you know, Sophie, when you came from Princeton, and watching you, sort of the joy as you experience that has been incredibly affirming. Yeah.
And infectious too.
Yeah.
And infectious.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's great. It's
How
exciting.
about you, Charlotte?
I think I'm in a kind of, I was going to say beetle stage, but maybe locust. I don't know. I'm kind of want to get out of the world for a while. And I feel a very strong need to just retreat from outwardness, even though I know it feeds my work all the time. But also as a novelist, you're kind of free to beetle around everywhere all the time, you know, and not being attached to, I mean, one of the kind of great joys of the Charles Perkins Centre thing, which was I was scared of being part of an institution because I didn't know how much that would kind of mess up the way that I worked. And so, I mean, and I think, frankly, being part of any other institution.
And there
Very
was,
much.
when you were introduced, there was somebody who came up to you, not quite sure what the writer-in-residence was going to do, and asked you whether, could you help me with my grant application?
Yeah. Quite a few people have said, oh, good, you're here. I've got an annual report and I've got some brochures that need...
No,
Steve
you
went.
misunderstood.
I was like, Steve! Anyway, I don't have a beautiful answer, but...
That is a beautiful answer. It sounds like there's time for inwardness too. So we might move now to open the floor to questions, and it's not going to be possible to address all the questions that you have today, but we'll do our very best to answer as many as we can in the time that we do have. First, how Q&A will work. On the screen and elsewhere, there will be information about slido.com, and we are going to take questions this evening through Slido. I understand if you head to slido.com and enter the Sydney Ideas as a code, so that's Sydney Ideas, one word, as a code, that will take you into Slido, and you'll be able to view or upvote various questions as well as contribute your own. An interesting one, which has received a number of upvotes, is asking this: how can we detect whether a story is misleading in the age of disinformation?
That's a great question, isn't it?
Sophie, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm pausing because I actually want to think about it. I'm going to say something along the lines of, this is in line with looking for trouble. There's not enough trouble in it. It's too smooth. It's too coherent. You know how now when you Google anything, there's that AI thing up the top, and it has this kind of plausibility to it that I've now realised is a sign of its unlikelihood, and that really what you're looking for is that texture, that nuance, or that roughness, I suppose, that gives story veracity. Yeah. Yeah.
And I would completely agree with that and say if it's simple and it makes you feel instantly good, then there's probably something dodgy. And that's why my problem with the word storytelling, because it's become associated with spin. That politicians are always saying, well, it wasn't that anything we did was wrong, it's just we didn't have the right narrative. Yeah. And I find that so insulting. But it's the same with business. With it, all we need is the right narrative, and then we'll get what we want. And so I guess, I like the idea that if we look for trouble in a narrative, it may have more veracity.
What about the other day I heard an academic tell me that they'd stumbled upon an article generated by AI that listed them as the lead author that they had never contributed to. And there was something in that they said, that there will always be signs that something's not quite right. And what is that a characteristic, do you think, Steve?
I think the fundamental characteristic is the story trying to convince you of something. And if it's trying to convince you of something, especially if it's citing evidence or supposedly citing evidence in what you know is a huge and contested field, then it's a con. A narrative that is there for the joy of it and isn't trying to convince you to do something or believe something, that's perfectly fine. If it's trying to convince you of the way of the world, and you can tell it has an ulterior motive, then you've got to be careful.
Yeah. A beautiful question here. We're on the land of the oldest living tradition of oral storytelling. How can we use the ancient tradition of oral storytelling for innovation? I know you've been reflecting on this recently, Sophie, but I might open it to others of what's the role of telling a story in kind of a living culture. I mean, is this something that happens in the Charles Perkins Centre, in the throes of exploring something, investigating?
Yeah. And we were obviously named after a major Indigenous figure in Australian history, actually, Charles Perkins. The one thing I've really learned from my Indigenous colleagues is the importance of yarning. And what yarning is immensely frustrating if you're trying to chair a meeting which has an agenda and an end point, but is fantastically good at exploring the various nuances of ideas. So it is riding the edge of chaos. You're pursuing pathways in narrative, and you're starting again and trying again. And it's a different way of thinking and conveying knowledge and creating things. And that and it releases you from having to worry about the agenda and there are things in life where you do need agendas and you've got to get it right, and operationally nothing will work without it. But it's important to have the yarning and the freedom to yarn, to explore.
It would seem to, particularly powerful when you are treading that line of chaos or sitting in discomfort with something doesn't seem quite right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's so interesting. I love that answer. The piece I'd add to that too is my understanding of some of the First Nations storytelling that I've studied is that story itself is not siloed. So it's not something where now it's story hour or, that there is a kind of integrated sense that story is work, story is ceremony, story is life, it's change, and so that it gives a very, I think, integrated account. So it is oral, and it's also very object-oriented and country-oriented too. So it's a very complete account of story that we, in some ways, have lost in our print traditions, I think.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that except thinking about the work of Alexis Wright. Incredibly complex, the storytelling in her work is like nothing in ordinary Western literature. I think I remember when I was reading the Swan book of hers and finding it really difficult until something clicked and I thought, the book has shown me how to read it. But it felt to me like rather our, Western storytelling is kind of linear, beginning, middle, end. And I felt after a while with the Swan book that it was more shaped like the roots of a tree, and kind of coiled roots of a tree that went back and back and back to the same kind of, often the same words, the same phrases. And it took me a long time and a lot of really hard work to finally get into the rhythm of that story rather than wanting it to be readable, sort of culturally to me. And I think Alexis is an incredible writer and has sort of invented on the page a new kind of First Nations literature, I think.
We perhaps have time for one more question from the audience this evening, and really thinking to the future, I wanted to share this one with each of you, which is question: what advice would we give to young writers who are grappling with the increasingly quick advances of technology that both encourages innovation but can kill inner creativity? And we might just broaden that to young academics or others. What advice would you give to young people who are grappling with increasingly quick advances of technology that can encourage innovation but kill inner creativity?
I think there's something really important about being a bit ignorant. If you know too much or attend too much to what other people have done or what AI can do, that's sort of paralysing, and the same's true in science. It's better to reinvent a wheel than to line all the existing wheels up and then look at them and not know what to do next. I'd rather explore the world in ignorance rather than know too much.
I mean, in terms of writing, I would say stay away from technology as much as you can, and be in the world. And I know that really that speaks to my age, in which I see being online as separate from being in real life, and I know that is not the case anymore. And yet, when I read new work, sometimes I sometimes feel with early writers, especially writers who've grown up in the internet age, that the imagery, the characters come from television. They come from film, They come from YouTube. They don't come from the world that we live in, because their gestures are things that you've seen on television. That, you know, nobody really does those things in real life. So I'm always saying, just look at the world around you really, really closely, and watch it and be in it rather than, and also be in nature.
Yeah.
It does something really important to your brain. Steve will know what that is, but it changes. I think trying to write from screens it's sort of deadening in every way.
Agreed.
What would your advice
Those are great answers, so won't add much, except to say that I think humans are having a comeback. I mean, we've been getting a bad rap for a while now, and that is for very good reasons, but nothing makes humans look better than AI, and I just think that, and actually I'd sort of strike that from the record. AI is doing a lot of very important things, and, you know, this capacity to learn and relearn to be human, you know, that is sort of, this is the moment for it. And so people wanting to be writers or to innovate in any way, I just think this is a golden moment. Yeah.
Well, as we draw tonight's conversation to a close, this has been a wonderful moment, and I want to thank Charlotte, Steve and Sophie for being companions on the journey. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, as I always do, but to be able to have this conversation together and with you, an audience who's been so engaged this evening and with such wonderful questions, it's been a real joy. It sparked lots of thoughts for me that I'm looking forward to taking away and reflecting on privately, perhaps taking them with me on a journey in something like a Whiteham Woods around Sydney sometime soon, and then bringing them back to throw apart various things that I might have concluded and to start again. So thank you so much, and please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you,
Okay,
Kate.
thank you. Thank you, Kate.
So what a fabulous evening here at Sydney Ideas. For links to resources and more upcoming talks, you can visit Sydney Ideas website, which is sydney.edu.au/Sydney Ideas. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, for all your questions and involvement. Please do stay around. We have some refreshments for you to enjoy, further conversations. Who knows who you might speak to and the serendipitous things that might take part. There are also opportunities to visit the stall being held this evening by Better Read Than Dead, which are selling copies of Charlotte's and Stephen's books, and we invite you to stay on and enjoy being with one another. So thank you very much. This has been Sydney Ideas. I'm Kate Harrison-Brennan. Thanks and good night.